Greetings everyone, and welcome to Adobe Rome in the Classroom. My name is Kim Cavanaugh and I'll be your instructor for this course. In this course you're going to be learning how to use Adobe Rome, a content creation tool, to allow your students to do all sorts of creative projects that involve drawing, animating, interactivity, and publishing. In particular, in this course we'll be looking at some of the common core objectives that require students now to be able to publish, to illustrate, to demonstrate, and to do the kind of deep thinking and sort of work that requires digital tools. And finally, we want to make sure that you'll have the opportunity to see how to share and publish your student work, and we're going to give you some ideas for lessons that you can do with your students along the way. In this first lesson, we'll get an overview of what Adobe Rome is all about. It may be the most interesting program that you've never heard about. Lots of really fascinating things that you can do with Adobe Rome with your students, things that they can make. I'm going to show some examples of some of the projects that you'll be doing in this course, and we'll take a quick tour of the Adobe Rome interface. It's quite likely that you've never heard of Adobe Rome. You've probably heard of Adobe Reader or Acrobat Reader. I'm sure you've heard of Adobe Photoshop. Adobe makes all sorts of products, including things like Illustrator and Dreamweaver and InDesign and all sorts of other creative processing tools. A few years ago, Adobe decided that they wanted to have a way for people who are perhaps not as technically proficient or not as interested in a professional career to be able to create content. In particular, they thought that there was a great market for students and work in school. And so they set about creating this new program, hired a group of programmers in Germany, and set them about the task of doing nothing but re-examining and thinking about how content could be created digitally. They came out with Adobe Rome. And as they were just about to release this as a commercial product tied into a web-based interface and cloud storage and Google applications, Adobe came to the decision that they would probably never make money on the product, and so ultimately they decided not to release it commercially. What they did do, however, was allow people to download the final version, the pre-release version that was completely done for free. And that version is the one that you'll be using in your classroom. Now, there are some things that will not be available to you because of the suspension of the complete Adobe Rome package. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. But for now, in the classroom, you can download this software via LANDesk or have your school tech have it installed for you. It's particularly a great product for use on laptop carts. And if you want to try it out at home, you simply go to the link that you see on the screen, or you can just type in Google Adobe Rome download. That was a real quick look at some of the kinds of things that you can do in Adobe Rome. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the instructional strategies, things to think about from a teaching perspective before we move along. Now, the examples I showed you were all sorts of projects that you might find that would be typical for a high school student to perform or upper and middle school student. But really, Adobe Rome is appropriate for all age levels. The drawing tools are easy enough for students as young as really second or third graders to get a grasp on how to do some of the basic drawing tasks. But the cool thing about Rome is that the program has a lot of really advanced features. So as your students are older, they can take on more tasks, and it's a great gateway to learn some of the more sophisticated things that you might want to teach students in follow-up courses in graphic design. For instance, the pen tool in Adobe Rome is similar to the same pen tool that you would see in Adobe Illustrator. And some of the photo editing filters that you'll find in Adobe Rome are the same kinds of filters that you'll find in Adobe Photoshop. So it's a great program to use to kind of get kids started. It's easy enough for young students to use, but sophisticated enough for older students to get value from as well. Now, there are some system requirements, and the big one is that you will have to have Adobe Air, the Air AIR runtime, which is a free download that you can acquire from Adobe. If you don't have that on your home computer, you might be prompted to do that. On school computers, that runtime should already be installed and shouldn't be have any effect on your ability to run Adobe Rome. And then finally, there are some things that were disabled once the software was released as open source. And I'll review those with you next. Just an things that you can do. In this first example here, we see a student newspaper. And this is a way that students could create a report digitally. Now, one thing about Adobe Rome is it's going to produce files that are either in the PDF or in a Flash format for publishing to the web, or in a JPEG format for just doing images. But there's a preview button right up at the top, and you always have the opportunity to preview the project as you're working along. So in this case, I've got my preview running for what would be a print project. I'd expect this one to come out in a version of a PDF, and I can post that on the web, share it with parents and so forth, and have them see, or I can print out my final report. And you see here you've got some nice font sizes and images that have been included in that project report. You can do similar kinds of things in Adobe Rome, this time in a more interactive environment. For this example, we are looking at some environmental issues around our area, and this produces a website. So when I click on my preview button to see this project, I see that I can click through and not only have images inserted, but also interactive Google Maps that I can actually zoom in and zoom out on. All of these things are available directly from within the Rome interface. I can also include audio files, video files, and so forth. So all sorts of really cool things that you can do. We got some examples of some math projects that you'll have the ability to share with your students for virtual manipulatives. We'll show you how to do animations like this one here, where you have an animated star that zooms along, things that fade in and fade out. There are just a tremendous number of things that you can do within the Adobe Rome interface. And the interface is fairly easy for students to pick up because it is context sensitive. So that when you select on an object within the Adobe Rome interface, you're going to see a little context editor, or a little editor that's going to appear by way of a pencil flyout. And it makes it very simple to find the things that you want to do to make a change to an object that you've created. You also have a toolbar to the left-hand side of my screen here that you can use for inserting, for drawing, for inserting text, for doing advanced operations with mixtures of colors, to do warping and so forth. And then down at the bottom of the interface, we actually have a timeline that lets you do animations. So all in all, it's a very sophisticated, elegant, and yet simple and easy to learn program that's suitable really for students in K-12 in all grade levels. What you see here is the Adobe Rome launch bar. This bar will appear each time you open the program or when your students open the program. And there are three elements on the launch bar that really just don't work anymore in the open source version. Now those have to do with the template exchange, which is no longer operational. That was intended to be a way that people could share different presentations or objects that they'd created in Adobe Rome, but that's been disabled. So if you attempt to go there, nothing's going to happen. Also, the My Account button. It's not required to use the My Account or have an Adobe account when using Adobe Rome. Initially, the plan was for people to be able to create documents on their desktop and then save them to their account, and then open them at home in a browser. And it really was a great idea, but when the decision was made not to release Adobe Rome commercially, that feature was disabled. And then finally, there's only very, very limited help files available, and there is no support. So these are the items that have been disabled. There are a few other things about Rome that we'll discuss as we go along that are no longer available. For instance, there is only a limited number of font styles that your students can use. But for the most part, everything works just fine on the desktop version. Just some of the online resources have been taken offline, and those will not work in the open source version of Adobe Rome. All right, now you've got a rough idea of what Adobe Rome is all about and seen some examples of the kinds of projects that you can do. Let's talk about what's required of you in this course. The course is broken up into a series of short tutorials that detail the individual tools that you find within the Adobe Rome interface. These are things like the toolbar and the timeline and the sidebar, all the different kind of mechanical things that are the ways that you make things happen within the software. These are suitable for showing to your students if you wish, although they may have a little bit of teacher talk interspersed here and there. For the most part, those short video clips are all about the tools themselves. Then we follow up with a series of how-to videos, and these give you some specific project ideas along with techniques that you might try out with your students. So things like how to create a newsletter or a website, how to use video and audio, and to do some real basic kind of programming that lets you be a little more interactive with the content, are all included in those how-to videos. Hopefully by the end of the course you'll have a really good appreciation for not only how Adobe Rome works, but more importantly, how you can use this program with your students to impact their learning.